3, 2, 1. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. And these are our final episodes of the year. Actually, this is running one right before the end of the year and one as our first episode of 2025. But here we are to kind of reflect a little on 2024 and launch ourselves into 2025. We've done this the last few years, reflecting a little bit on some of our favorite episodes and some of the kind of history and historical trends, and also kind of like how was your year? Although I may not lead with that question for our guest this time.
Let's keep it light, man.
Let's keep it light. It's the holidays.
Coming in hot.
But here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there. Nice to see you. We are doing this video episode 2, which was a big thing we started doing in 2024, so folks can go watch it on YouTube. But hi there.
Happy New Year, Jody.
Thank you.
There.
And we should say, well, I should give a little caveat right off the bat that if people hear little pitter patter in the background or noises in the background, my New Year's tradition is all of our group of friends get together every year. We've done it for decades now. Used to do it without kids, now with kids, but we rent a big house, we hang out, we have a great time during New Year's. There are 16 adults and 12 kids, I think, somewhere in this house beyond these walls. So I would not be surprised if one of those voices makes its way onto this podcast. But it's very fun. And on the other side of this recording is a trip to a local indoor water park. So we're going to keep it snappy, okay?
That'll be fun.
Any traditions or fun things for you around New Year's?
I always do New Year's as a very low-key kind of event because I don't want to wake up on January 1st and feel bad. And certainly the New Year's that I did in my 20s left me feeling a little rough the next day. So I've really focused on having just like a kind of cozy New Year's Eve and launching the year kind of how I want to live the year, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I'm pretty much the same. Like ever since I've had kids, really. I kind of can't stay up past 10 p.m.
Yeah.
It's really sad. Like I get to 10:30, 10:45. I'm like, I'm not going to make it. So
but
sometimes
do your kids make it? That's the question.
Oh, no. My kids go to bed at like 7:30. So like, they definitely don't make it. But usually I just sort of chill. I go to bed early. And then, I kind of like Nikki, sort of just prep for the new year.
I like that too. So let's talk a little bit about this year. And, we should say we're recording this just after the passing of Jimmy Carter. And I want to start getting some thoughts about Carter. Obviously, like a big moment whenever a president dies. I also think it's sort of fitting, actually, because I think he's been a big part of this show and sort of talking about him and how we've thought about him and the episodes we've done is actually a kind of interesting way to do a little wrap up of both this year and just kind of where we're at with regards to the show. But any initial thoughts on him? And then we'll talk about some of the episodes that we've done.
His passing strikes me as very timely in a way, that it comes at the end of an interesting year politically. He has been really holding on for more than 2 years since entering hospice. And it is this kind of reflective time at the end of the year, which is an interesting moment both to reflect on his legacy and to reflect on the presidency more broadly. I think a lot of people have focused on Jimmy Carter's character and the character he brought to office. Yeah. I was writing a little bit about it yesterday and thinking about how, at least in the public imagination, Carter was sometimes too small for the office of the presidency and larger than life when he left it. Like his post-presidency, which spanned 45 years, seemed in some ways to be a real model because it was centered on his character. It wasn't about making tons of money. It wasn't about, draping himself in glory. It was about making the world a better place. Yeah. And there's something kind of beautiful about that. And then historians are debating his legacy, right? Yeah. Was he... did he create a more liberal government? Was he fundamentally conservative? I mean, there is something conservative about this idea that he wasn't doing a ton in public office and then really made his mark on the world in private life as a private citizen. But he also accomplished quite a lot too as president, which I know we've talked about on the show.
Yeah. This moment's interesting because I'm not shocked, but I'm a little saddened. And I think that's just because when you have someone who's lived 100 years, they've been around for so long as a part of either your imagination or your reality, it's kind of a little bittersweet to let that go. Obviously, people can't live forever, but when you think of Jimmy Carter, there were a lot of running jokes about like, man, he's still kicking it.
Yeah.
He's still around. And I also think that I guess part of my lament is about thinking of a president that just had such integrity and a desire to right wrongs. And I think that when it comes to Jimmy Carter, I think a lot about his just mission for human rights, like his mission for decency. And not just, throwing those ideas out there, but really trying to implement them. I mean, when I was in college, I built houses for Habitat for Humanity and did things that, these are Jimmy Carter's brainchild. And when I think about just, especially when it comes to like his relationship with African Americans and how he was always able and willing to call a spade when it came to things that were just, no, that's straight up racist. Like, Jimmy Carter was very honest about that. And I just appreciated the way that he thought about the world and tried to interact with people. I thought, part of that too is like his faith background plays a big role into just how like he maneuvered throughout the world. And yeah, I appreciate someone who I feel like, I don't know. Now, sometimes when you see like a lot of these political people and they attach their faith or their religion to their beliefs, it's very toxic and it's very harmful
and cynical.
And yes,
Mm-hmm.
yes. And uninclusive. And when you think of Jimmy Carter, he sort of gives you the opposite of that. He brings you his faith, and at the same time, it's so loving and so inclusive and so desiring to improve people's lives that it's just striking, especially today.
I agree. I think, I've talked a lot about on this show kind of how I've just been thinking a lot about decency and values and the sort of core, humanity at the heart of what I think good leadership is and how we've tended to lose that. Someone posted, asked me on Blue Sky, which is where I'm doing most of my social media these days. But, someone said, is Jimmy Carter the consensus best person to have ever become president? And it's a really interesting kind of bold statement, but actually, like, you think about it, like, maybe so.
Mm-hmm.
Just as like, I don't want to hype him up too much, say he's the greatest person ever, but in terms of people who become president, make a list of 40, whatever, there's a chance he was the best human being. Someone else was like, what about Abe Lincoln? I was like, there was some darkness there. I don't know if I'd want to, but yes, just that reminder that like you can live a life of values and decency. And, we'll talk about his political legacy and his time in office. Sometimes that is an impediment, and sometimes that sort of colors the way that you do politics, and gets in the way of the sort of hard-edged need for politics sometimes. But I will take that over deep cynicism.
Any day.
Any day. We have talked about Carter a lot on this show. It's become a little bit of a sort of like justice for Carter has become a little thing on our show a little bit. I mean, I think his presidency in particular fits really nicely into the sort of push of this show, which is like, let's look at some smaller moments, let's rethink some moments, let's use kind of moments from the past to kind of, so there's a lot of like little interesting ephemera from his presidency that I think is just fits the vibe of this show nicely. And so, we actually sent the newsletter out this morning, compiling all of those. I think it was like 7 or 8 episodes, but we talked about his encounter with that killer swamp rabbit that became a thing. The Billy beer fiasco, where his sort of like black sheep brother was selling a beer and Carter had to deal with that. I really loved the episode we did. I think it was at the end of last year about how the Carter campaign was the first one to really kind of hack the Iowa caucuses and really figure out how to kind of run a really important machine there and through the primaries. 3 Mile Island we've done an episode on, and then just this year, and this was actually going to be my nominee for favorite episode of the year, one of my favorites, but was the 1-900 number that Jimmy Carter set up, where he took calls from average Americans and it kind of went sideways, but actually was like a real kind of example of like his very earnest desire to like connect with people. So anyway, that we've been posting a list of those on Blue Sky and in our newsletter. People can go check it out. But there's this bigger idea of his presidency, and this is, I'm curious your thoughts. Like, has doing this show, has touching him from time to time, made you rethink his actual presidency? So many people are talking his post-presidency, but like those 4 years that he was actually in office I feel like one of the big things I've learned about the show is those feel like a genuine hinge point in American history, his presidency to me. And I'm curious just if you have thoughts, Nikki, you can start about his actual time in office.
It's a great question because I've been thinking about it a lot in terms of the moment he became president, because he takes a lot of flack for being ineffectual, like that his decency and his managerial style sort of held him back from really filling the office and taking up the bigness of the presidency. And yet at the time, that's what Americans wanted.
Yeah.
They were coming off of Watergate. The theme of politics in that era was restraint, right? Yeah. Congress was trying to restrain the president, to restrain U.S. power. And that can go in very libertarian ways, but it's also fundamentally about accountability and humility. And I think he often gets read as a president who was too timid, when I think he was a president who was trying to embody this idea of humility in office. Yeah. And what's fascinating about it is that that's what Americans said that they wanted. And then Reagan shows up and they're like, ooh, man on horseback. And so not for want of trying.
A Hollywood star. I mean, to me, context is everything. Like, you kind of can't look at Jimmy Carter's presidency absent from what happened before. Like, you have to take in Nixon, you have to take in Ford, you have to kind of think of Vietnam and the larger sort of post-70s-ish moment. And that's kind of how I look at Carter. You're coming off a couple of decades of just like distrust in federal government, of, the way that people have become disillusioned to think about the world and the wars that were taking place in it, and civil rights and women's rights. And here comes along Jimmy Carter as a person who generally seems well-intentioned, and is not a superstar. And I think that's okay. I think we need models like that so we can experience what it is and then say, okay, if this is what we want, we'll keep it. If not, we'll keep moving. Yeah. But like, I don't know. I think Jimmy Carter gave everybody a minute to sort of take a beat and recalibrate.
Well,
and recalibrate they did.
Yeah, but take a beat and recalibrate, I think, to his own detriment. Look, I mean, Carter, didn't handle some of the crises that were in front of him for sure. Fair. But I feel like one of the big themes that I've noticed in American history, we've talked about it, sort of one of the things this show has helped me understand is just the power of backlash politics. And then specifically the phenomenon of, and I'll just kind of say it plainly, it feels like often Democratic presidents get handed a deeply broken system, spend 4 to 8 years trying to sort of restore it. And then the American people, sometimes rightfully so, get fed up, and there's a deep backlash to that. And I think Carter is an example of that. I mean, you're right, Kelly. Like, context is everything. Coming off of an incredibly cynical, broken post-Watergate, post-Vietnam era, Carter tries, as you were saying, to restore and recalibrate. And then it doesn't happen in 4 years because you can't fix a country in 4 years. And also, there's some genuine crises that he doesn't handle very well. But then you get to Reagan. And I think, again, another thing I've really come to understand, that first Reagan run was not mourning in America. It was a lot more cynical and hard-edged than people remember. And that was a backlash politics kind of election that he ran. And I think it plays into, it's so resonant to now, and I'm sure there's a million think pieces already out there about Carter and Biden being the one-term bridge presidents who couldn't sort of like stem the tide of backlash or whatever. But, there's some truth to that. And so that's a little bit of what I'm thinking about, kind of his role and his bridge moment and setting up the backlash that was that first Reagan run.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah. There's also, I mean, Nikki, you know this, we make everything a media story, but like so many of the Carter stories feel like they are related to a changing media environment as well. This 1-900 number that he set up, this kind of like rabbit story going viral in the way that it did. It just feels like that late 70s into the 80s moment was also one in which just like the political, he was president while the sort of political media was just changing in an incredibly rapid way. And you could probably say that of every president, right? Like, I mean, most presidents, like that's a big thing that defines them is do you keep up with the media environment or not? But I think the Carter years, certainly that's a big part of what I've been thinking about too.
But this was a particular moment when the press had decided presidents aren't too big to fail,
right,
and we can play a role in exposing what they do. And so that the sort of reverence that surrounded the presidency had really cracked under Johnson and then disintegrated under Nixon. And that kind of aggressive oppositional journalism, which is absolutely necessary for a democracy to function well, when it hits someone who doesn't have a ton of scandal, what you get instead is this kind of tabloid political coverage
right,
that focuses in on these moments like the rabbit, like
create
Billy
a scandal.
Beer.
It's also worth saying though, like, Carter also was, I mean, I think there's a documentary that I called Rock and Roll President. He was called that. And, I mean, he was a sort of pop culture president in many ways. People forget that. I heard a great piece on the BBC last night. I was driving up here and happened to catch the actual radio. And they did a long retrospective about how Carter had a deep sort of love, but also used music. Like, there's an argument to be made that, like, Carter became president because of the Allman Brothers. Like, I mean, there's a real kind of, like, deep sort of pop culture connection to his presidency. So he was sort of aware of the changing media landscape and cultural landscape.
He did an interview with Playboy.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, right. That's another episode we've done where he admitted that he had lust in his heart, right? And we did that an episode with the great Alexis Coe about that. And I'm remembering, I didn't put it in the roundup that we emailed out this morning, but we did this year do a sort of retrospective about SNL and presidencies. And I think Carter was a big part of that, making fun of Ford and then making fun of Carter, I think was an indication, Nikki, to your point. All right. Well, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about, we've already name checked a few episodes we've done this year, not to make this all about ourselves, but I'm curious if either of you have some episodes that we did this year that jump out for you. I've got some stats about what we did this year. So we did 134 episodes this year, roughly, I think, and counting. I know, can you believe it?
I know.
The decade we covered the most, maybe not surprising, but the 1960s, we did about 13 episodes. The 1980s, we did about 12. I mean, I certainly feel like the Reagan years just feels like something we're more and more gravitating to. We did 8 episodes on the 2020s. That's already history at this point. So,
that's crazy.
Sneak some of those in. 10 episodes on the 50s, 70s, and 2000s, and then a handful of episodes about certainly did a bunch of episodes about the 19th century and even maybe the 18th century here and there. So I'm curious what, episodes jump out for you. And then moreover, not just say like that was fun, but like, I'm very curious to hear, especially you two, how your historical thinking has changed and changes year to year. That's part of why I love doing these episodes. So, I think you can also start to talk a little bit about kind of like what you've learned and what you've thought and so forth. But want to shout out a couple episodes, Kelly?
Yeah, so I listed a bunch here. One that's just popped out to me was the Columbia protests because of 1968, I should say, to clarify. And we did that right around the time of the actual student protests. And having gone to Columbia with Nikki, it was, for me, it was like, wow, the more things change, the more things sort of stay the same. To think about how students have navigated protests and activism and how they have either employed or not employed the neighboring area and the larger public, how effective or ineffective it's been, how presidents have responded and well or otherwise. It just sort of popped out as like, man, we are here again in this moment. What lessons are we learning? Why do we keep failing at this? Why do we keep messing up? And it just still kind of boggles my mind, as a college professor, how are we to teach? How are we to instruct? And at the same time, come down on students who take the information knowledge that we give them and then employ it, for their own understanding and their own activism. There's so much about that moment that I come back to again and again, because every time I'm in the classroom, it's like, this is the work that we're doing. We're trying to bring understanding and knowledge and activism to our students. I tell all of my students, like, I want them to be student activists. And that doesn't mean I want you to get arrested. It means, like, I want you to act on what you know. I want you to get this information and let it inform, either how you vote or where you work or who you hire or who you fire. Like, and that to me just sticks out.
Can we stick?
Yeah, go. No, please.
Can we stick with that for a second? Because I too have been thinking a lot about this, and this actually goes to like things that have been really moving around in my head in terms of my historical thinking. Because that moment was one of those where it was like, why did no one in charge pick up a history book to figure out how this was going to go? What is it about these protests that even though these very smart people who run universities know this history, decided that it was better to use police power against their students than allow these protests to continue? And gosh, we haven't talked a ton about Palestine on the show, and that's probably right given our focus. But I have really been grappling this year with the threat that protests in support of Palestine pose to our institutions and why they are so reactionary in response to them and what that says about our institutions and their values. And I wasn't like one of those people who was Pollyannish about any U.S. institution and its relationship to power. But this really, I think that the scale of the response in places like Colombia, which again did this 50, 60 years ago, but also places like the University of Virginia, to have them bring out riot police against their students, knowing the recent history of that university. I'm still a little floored, and it makes me very interested in those dynamics and why universities are just so scared of students.
Yes.
Well, we mentioned this on the episode we did, I think, but there was I remember someone had a sign at the Columbia protest that said, why make me read Edward Said if you don't want me to then take some lessons from it, But to your point, Kelly, it's like we ask people to live their values. Universities talk about that all the time, and then here's proof of that. And we didn't mention this, but Jimmy Carter, right? I mean, there's someone who clearly saw like the values are your values are your values, and he was a champion of the Palestinian people, and it was connected, and that idea of it all being connected was a big thing I've been thinking about. Something that I think this episode we did on the protests and just watching the protests in general have spurred for me, because if you look back to those 1968 protests, the larger questions of the Vietnam War and America's imperialism are connected to local fights on the Columbia campus, and I will be honest, like I've had my moments where I've been a little dismissive of like, oh, this is just a little interscene campus fight. Why should we care? They're occupying the president's office about something. But, I think there's a real understanding that no, like it is all connected. Your values are your values are your values. And,
because these kids are going to graduate and they're going to get jobs and they're going to have to determine how they want to interact in whatever field they go into, be it business or medicine or law. And it matters,
One other quick thought that's just occurring to me, and this is related to something we can do on here too, but just sort of shout out work that we've loved this year. But I just finished watching Say Nothing, which is the FX TV series based on Patrick Radden Keefe's book. I gotta say, like, I finished watching that and I was like, this might be one of the greatest TV shows of all time. Like, I was shocked that it wasn't talked about that way. I thought it was like twice as good as the second best TV show this year. Like, I was genuinely just blown away. I'm like maybe like The Wire, Deadwood, and maybe Say Nothing at this point. I just finished watching it, so to be fair,
that good.
But it's that good. I mean, I thought it was that good. There's a moment in there that makes me think of what we were talking about here in terms of the sort of progress and protest and liberation struggles and how long they can take. And so the film, the series focuses in on like a 2-month, 3-month period that's super heated, and then and it's like in the late 60s during the Troubles, and then there's like this montage that's like 1974, 1975, 1976, and it goes like all the way into the 80s, and then it goes to like the peace talks, right? And just that montage is like, oh right, you have these heated moments where things blow up and campuses go crazy and there's bombings, but then it just keeps going year after year after year, the struggle, and then you never know when it's going to kind of break through. And so I don't know, that's on my mind, but just sort of this. I mean, no one wants the genocide in Gaza to go on for years and years and years, but I think understanding that it wasn't just like, oh, there were those protests that spring and now it's over, or that like things aren't heated as right now as they were last spring, so that means that people have
or they were decades ago,
or whatever. Like it is just an ongoing thing, and this progress takes a long time, and you never know. That's the point of applying continuous pressure. You never know when it's going to kind of break through.
Yeah.
I also have to say that this is on the continuing on with our favorite episodes front, and this is going to sound a little kiss ass, so I'm sorry, but honestly, Kelly, your work is the work that I have been thinking about so much this year. Both your first book, Force and Freedom, but also we did a week on We Refuse.
Oh, yeah.
Thinking about legitimate uses of violence and the way that conversation around nonviolence, which is so important and actually is something that like I am drawn to as a value system. At the same time, your constant challenge to say, who is that in service of, and what options do people have? What are our choices against an unjust system? We've seen this refract out in so many ways this year, and not just in terms of protest in Palestine, but the Luigi Mangione situation, in resistance to police brutality, like in all of these different ways, we have been circling around this conversation around violence in society as both this sign of fracture and the sort of shredding of the social fabric, but also in revolutionary times, how people think about the political uses of violence. And it is such a hard conversation to have. People really run away from it. And the fact that you run toward it is why I keep not only your We Refuse book, but Force and Freedom, why I just keep not letting myself just go to the easy, well, nonviolence is good. Talk about Gandhi.
That's what happens when it doesn't work. You know what I mean? Like I do think about that a lot too, because someone asked me like, I think it was after the election. It was like, oh, are we going to protest? Are people going to march? And I was like, I don't know. Is that going to work? Like, I want what's effective. Like, people want what's effective. And I think people are at that moment of questioning, like, we could do this, but will it work? Does it help? Is it useful?
So we're going to do a part 2 of this conversation, kind of looking forward to next year. I think these are questions we should return to, absolutely, because I think we all have thoughts about what does this coming year look like with a sort of history-minded lens. But let's keep shouting out episodes or other moments or whatever. So Nikki, any episodes that popped out?
Yes. We did very few animal episodes this year, and obviously we will rectify that.
Yeah.
But the Groundhog Day episode is one of those. It's just like one of my favorite type of episodes that we do, where there's a big furry animal involved that doesn't scare Kelly. So it's not a rat. It's not a possum. But that it was like steeped in this German immigrant lore that kind of got like twisted around in the sort of landscape of Pennsylvania. And then the gender politics of it.
Yeah.
I mean, justice for Puxatawny Phyllis, who was just repeatedly replaced as though we wouldn't notice. I think this happened with like Samantha on Bewitched or Daryl on Bewitched, but the idea that you could just swap them out. You're not going to get that bias. So I love that episode.
Yeah.
That was cute. That was a lot of fun. I love the fun episodes. Those
but you're right. More animals needs to happen. We have on our YouTube page, go subscribe to the YouTube page, folks, but we have there a compilation of all the animal stories we've done. And it's been a while since I've added one. So we will rectify that.
Also, shout out the episode on shirtless George Washington. We need more hot people.
I thought that was last year. I was like, we did that this year.
They pile up. They
do.
Okay, a couple more, and then we'll wrap up part 1 of this conversation.
I have kind of a sad one and then kind of a cheesy one. So the sad one is the Ray brothers and their house being burned down. And blanking on the name of the guest that we had on that show.
Yeah, Marcus, who does Making Gay History.
Yes, yes.
And so this was the story of the young boys in Florida who were HIV positive, tons of sort of like stigma from their community, and then their house was burned down. I mean, they were what, like 8, 9, and 12?
Maybe 11 at the most. And that just, there are very few episodes that we do where I am like actively fighting not to cry. And like I try like, I promise myself I never cry. But sometimes we touch on really hard episodes, and that one was really hard because I just abhor the idea of people trying to harm children. Like I mean, no one likes that, but it's just such a trigger. And that episode was just really powerful. And especially because the guest we had on the show just brought in so much more context and nuance to like the larger moment of how people were being treated that had HIV. That was just so gripping and moving. And that story stuck with me. There are some stories that sit with me like for like a better part of a week. I'm still thinking about like that person or that moment. And that did it for me. But on a much lighter note, the cherry blossoms in DC will always have a special. I thought we had covered this episode before, but I guess we hadn't. But I try to go see the cherry blossoms every year if I can. There's some seasons that I miss it, but it is just, there is nothing more wonderful about being in DC during cherry blossom season. Like, it's just, I love bringing my kids. I love seeing it through their eyes. I love taking pictures. I just love the idea that it's this gift from another country, like from Japan. Like, it's
and it also had this woman at the heart of it, right? Who was the real champion. I'm forgetting her name. There you go, folks. You see how quickly. But you know, but there was a real sort of champion at the heart of it who just for years and years and years said basically, we're going to make this happen. And they did eventually. Yeah. Can I shout out another tree related one?
Yeah.
Just I got to say, like, I mean, I think you have a bias towards recent episodes, but I think the run we did kind of in the last couple months was among our best ever. They're very good, including the one on the red delicious apples. And I said this on the show itself, but you know, I love these moments where your kind of lived experience and intuition connect with like a big historical trend. And so this idea, like, yeah, apples got really crappy when I was a kid, right? Like, I'm not making that up. And then, no, I wasn't making that up. And moreover, it ties to this much bigger, interesting political story about the industry kind of starting to dial it in a little bit, and then Congress needing to come in and incentivize it to come up with better apples. I also want to shout out all the listeners who volunteered to help me be my apple Sherpa and kind of like help me figure out the world of apples. I got like dozens of emails. Someone was like, oh, let me connect you with my uncle who has a farm. And I was like, I don't know if I followed up on that one, but I got some good tips. Cosmic Crisp is a part of my life now. I really love it.
Mine too. I've had basically like an apple a day since that episode because I discovered Cosmic Crisp.
Service journalism for us.
Like keep those recommendations coming. Help me eat more fruits and vegetables.
I know.
For sure. All right, Nikki, any last one, and then we'll wrap up part one here.
I think that's it for me. I mean, I really liked that last run that we did, including Eisenhower going to war with that tree is so funny to me. And, we connected it to his torturing of squirrels, which, I don't love that he did that. Not great insight into the military industrial complex. But just like highlighting the just petty Karenness of Dwight Eisenhower delights me to no end.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this, and then next episode, we'll kind of look a little bit forward to 2025. But I think, to point out some of the things that we did this year, in addition to stories we like to cover. I mean, we did launch our newsletter, which people should go subscribe to. But, it's been really wonderful to kind of every week compile a bunch of interesting events that happen that week and then write little essays to try and connect through with them. Thanks to everyone who's been responding. But we would love to get the number of subscribers there up because we're trying to do more and more and more in the newsletter. We've been doing more video episodes like this. We certainly did a bunch about the election, more on kind of our look at current events coming in the next episode. We'll talk about our plans for next year. We did a live show. Remember that? That was really lovely.
Yeah. That was so much fun.
Another 2025 thing. I mean, I'll say it next episode, but I'll say it now. I want to do more live shows. I will end by saying, when you, and people who heard last episode heard me say this, but when you kind of put your podcast on Spotify, they send you a Spotify Wrapped, just like you would if you're listening to music on Spotify, they send you some stats. If you're a creator on Spotify, they send you some stats about your podcast. And I was so heartened to see that our most listened episode on Spotify was Dick Cheney shoots his friend in the face.
Yeah.
And so I'm just like immensely proud of us and immensely proud of our audience for kind of gravitating to that episode. That's why we reran it last episode. But, we'll see what the Dick Cheney shoots his friend in the face of 2025 is. And it'll show up in our Spotify Wrapped. But that is the wrap of this episode, part 1. We'll be back with part 2, looking a little more towards 2025, some of the big ideas in terms of the current world and history and some of the plans for this show. We'll be back next episode with that. But for now, Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
And listeners, thanks to you. Thanks to Jacob and Carla and Brittany and Radiotopia who helped make this show. But it's been a really wonderful year. The next time you hear our voices will be 2025, and we will see you then.